Hey, everybody, we're going to start in about 2 minutes. We're going to get everybody an opportunity to dial in, and then we'll get started. So about 2 minutes. All right, we've got a good sized class today. We're going to give everybody about another minute or so to get dialed in and get everything ready to go, and then we'll jump into today's webinar. All right, about another 30 seconds and we'll get started today. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. We truly appreciate it. We know, especially this time of year, schools are just buzzing crazy, getting ready for the end of the year. So we do really, truly appreciate all the time that you've allocated to us today. So we'll go ahead and get started. So today's presentation or today's webinar is for specifically targeted at facilities managers. And I've titled it Roles and Responsibilities, and that's not really a great title. It's more along the lines of strategies that we can hopefully help you with as you're trying to manage the chemicals in your district, or in your school. So we'll talk about that. I'm Becky Anderson. I've been involved with school safety and science safety for about the last 25 or 30 years. I ran a program in Iowa called Rehab the Lab, and it was a spinoff of the Washington State Rehab the Lab program. And through that program, we were able to support almost, gosh, I want to say like 98% of the schools in school districts in Iowa participated in that program that was run in conjunction with the insurance carrier that insures most of the schools. And we removed and assisted them in disposal with more than 500,000 pounds, so about 530,000 pounds of hazardous chemicals. I've got a background as a hazmat chemist. I also have been an emergency responder as a volunteer firefighter for a few years. Before we really dive in today, I want to say thank you to EPA Region 1 for funding this, and also a quick thank you to Vicki Davis of the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. So Vicki was the one that obtained the grant for us to be able to lead these webinars for you. And then also you'll notice a number of the pictures today have Dave Waddell's name on them. Dave is my mentor. He's now retired, but he started this Rehab the Lab movement across the United States, and it's been has developed a ton of resources that are very helpful. And I hope to have a number of those available for you to share here in the next few weeks. So the goals of this webinar series is really ultimately just to make schools safer and to make sure that schools are managing their chemicals safely and in compliance with the regulations. And that's both OSHA and EPA regulations, as well as the state regulations that you operate under. So a lot of the information that I'm going to provide you with today, one of the things I'm going to do is I'll point out to you which regulations you operate under. But then I'll also tell you, I need to make sure that you verify those with the state agencies. So let's go ahead and get started quick. These are just some technical tips from EPA. EPA is providing us with some Zoom support services today. And so what you'll notice is that we don't have the little hand raised thing, and you cannot add any information into the chat. However, if you do have questions or concerns, or you want to share any information, please put it into the Q&A. I will try to pay attention to that throughout the webinar today and make sure that we get your questions answered as much as possible. If we don't have time for specific questions, or if there's something that I can't answer, I'll make sure to take a note of that, and then I will address it with you individually as well. Also, at the end of the presentation, on the very last slide, you'll see my email and my phone number, as well as my company's website, and you're welcome to reach out if you have some specific questions or concerns about some, things that are going on in your particular school. I'm happy to try to help you as much as I can, make things safer and make sure that you're operating in compliance. All right, topics for today. So previously what we've done is we've looked at and implemented what's called the RAMP method of evaluating chemicals. And this is from the American Chemical Society, and it works out pretty well. And basically RAMP stands for recognize, assess, minimize, and prepare. And we've worked with teachers for the last several webinars to assess whether or not they have legacy chemicals in their school, given them some options on how to dispose of them. We've also discussed minimizing chemical inventories based on 4 criteria, whether the chemical is too old, whether it's too dangerous or presents too much risk for what the benefit that it brings, whether they have too large of a quantity in their classroom, or whether they have damaged containers. So those were 4 criteria that we worked with science teachers to identify. And then we've also talked about preparing. So preparing for emergencies, preparing for things to go sideways, and just evaluating whether or not and how risky chemicals are, using safety data sheets, and then ultimately developing a chemical hygiene plan for the school. The chemical hygiene plan is a requirement under OSHA, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. We're going to also talk a little bit more about OSHA's hazard communication plan. And even if you are not in an OSHA state where you have your own OSHA program, OSHA at the federal level still applies to you. And additionally, what we found is that there are other agencies, Department of Labor and Department of Education, specifically in New Hampshire, have adopted certain OSHA programs. So they are still required for you, and you've got to make sure that you're in compliance with them. So today's topics are specifically, what are the OSHA hazard communications? What is the OSHA hazard communication program, and how can you use it to your benefit? We'll go through some safety data sheets, and then go through also what are the requirements for that program. We'll talk about disposal strategies that facilities can implement, and then we'll also talk about how facility staff can stay safe around hazardous chemicals. I know this is the time of year that a lot of you will come into school and find surprises sitting on carts in front of your doors. I've heard it for years and years now from facilities managers, that all of a sudden you walk into school one day and there's a cart of stuff sitting outside your door. So one of the things I want to talk about today is how can you safely address those things and make sure that your staff are safe as they're working throughout the buildings. All right, a couple of final housekeeping notes. Post your questions to the question and answer box, and I'll do my best to answer those for you. And then as you work through the information in this presentation, as you take any notes, please know that I'm always happy to try to assist you and provide you with additional resources if you need them. Finally, this information is current as of 2024. So if you happen to have found this training on the internet and it's 2027 or it's 2042, please know that this was current as of 2024 with the regulations that were in place at this time. Okay, we have worked in science to recognize and assess high hazard and legacy chemicals. Science has prepared a map of their classroom of the lab safety equipment and an inventory of chemicals that they want to keep and use. They're also, through our webinars, we've encouraged them to be mindful of the PPE, personal protective equipment, and the spill kit materials that they need to have in place so that they are prepared for an emergency. In addition to that, we've encouraged them to include, as part of their lab instructions, safety information and a disposal plan. So as far as their lab notes go, there should be a section that says, these are the safety things that I also need to teach my students. And then these are the disposal plan that I have in place when this lab is done. We've also talked about waste regulations, safety data sheets. Waste regulations are difficult. to make sure that you're in compliance with, because they are different from state to state. So I'm going to give you some guidelines that are general, but I want to make sure that you understand that for your specific state, you'll need to make sure that you're operating in compliance as you determine disposal strategies. So what this webinar is not. So this isn't me adding more to your job description or more to your job duties. Really, my goal here is to hopefully provide you with some guidance to make the duties that you're already doing a little easier, and also to provide you with some information and some resources so that you can help keep your staff safe. So what we're going to predominantly focus on are hazard communication requirements. This section of code at the federal level is located in the 29th section, or the 29th book of the Code of Federal Regulations. And the chapter is 1910-1200. So that's where you want to look to make sure that you're following these hazard communication regulations. I know we have a lot of training for hazard communications that takes place when we're doing beginning of the year training or end of the year closeout training. I want to take just a few minutes to show you some of the easy strategies that you can use those safety data sheets for, sections that you can go directly to help you assess the risk of the chemicals that you're using in a kind of a quick and dirty way. So in Vermont, one of the things I want to talk about also is how there's some confusion about whether or not, if you don't have a state authorized OSHA program, well, then you just aren't subject to it. Or if you're a government employee, then you are not subject to it. Well, I'm going to tell you, in the case of OSHA's Hazard Communication Program, or HAZCOM, as it's referred to a lot, if you're from Vermont, you are covered under this regulation and you are subject to it. Vermont's OSHA does enforce this regulation. In New Hampshire, it's a little bit different. There's no state OSHA program, but you are subject to this federally. The other thing that gets confusing in New Hampshire is that there are some worker classes that are excluded. However, the Department of Labor has stepped in and decided that, you know what, this is a really good section of OSHA code and we want to implement it. So in New Hampshire, the Department of Labor has fully adopted the hazard communication standard, and they are the ones that enforce it. I actually developed a really good connection at the Department of Labor. And so if there are any New Hampshire specific questions that anyone has, I'm happy to either connect you with that resource, or also, oh yes, perfect, Kathy, thank you so much. There's a reference in the question and answer box about New Hampshire OSHA assistance. But if you have any specific questions to the situation that you're in, I'm happy to help connect you with that contact at Department of Labor, or ask those questions directly for you. So the next few slides, what we're going to do is we're going to go over 1910-120. Okay. The key requirements for compliance with the OSHA hazard communication standard is that you collect and have safety data sheets. And it's acceptable now if those are OSHA collected. And these are supposed to be required for all commercial, or these are required for all commercial products. These are not household products. So that's one of the biggest differences. And I do get a lot of questions. I get a lot of questions in industry about this. So do you have to have a safety data sheet for something like your whiteout or your markers that you use, your dry erase board markers, anything like that? And the answer to that is no. If it's something that you find in your household or you can purchase for your household, then you are not required to have a safety data sheet for it. Now, I'm going to add a little caveat to this. One of the things I would encourage you to do is, even if you're dealing with non-commercial products and there are things, cleaners, etc., that you use that are available to households to use, I'm going to encourage you to have a safety data sheet, because there are a lot of other criteria in the hazard communication program that require an evaluation of how much risk there is associated with that product. So I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and keep safety data sheets for all the chemicals that are at your site and are used for your site. Now, of course, there are some that are very minor. Use your, I'm going to tell you to use your best assessment here. All right. If you're using something like Simple Green, okay, that's a commercially available cleaning product. It's also available to households. I would encourage you to have a safety data sheet for that. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, you want to be able to evaluate the threat that that chemical brings into your school district. Two, you want to know how it's going to impact your personnel if you have an exposure, a splash, a spill, somebody dumps it all over their front, anything like that. You want to know if it's going to be, how that person is going to be impacted and what first aid you need to provide to them. And then the other thing is you want to be able to provide that if there is an accident to your emergency responders or to a hospital so that they can correctly assess what treatment a person that's been exposed may need. Another OSHA HAZCOM program requirement are labeled containers. And one of the challenges that I see in all the schools that I've been in over the years is that we really kind of, we don't get this labeling done as correctly as we should. There are specific requirements for what needs to be on those labels. So if you're taking a concentrated solution and diluting it and putting in something like spray bottles or mop buckets, there needs to be a label on there. And under OSHA, that label is required to have a pictogram, signal words, hazard and precautionary statements, the name of the product, and the manufacturer's contact information. All of those things are required. One of the things that you can do is ask your vendors, if you're buying concentrated solutions, do they have dilute solution labeling that they can provide you with? And a lot of them have developed those over the years. So that's one of the ways that I would encourage you to reach out to the manufacturers or the product reps that you're working with and see if they have any of those labels available to you. I would also ask them for even the concentrated stuff, ask them for supplemental or additional labels. That way you've got some on hand if something gets damaged or it becomes unreadable. The third requirement is pictograms. These are 9 symbols that your employees should be able to recognize at a glance to determine what risk they're indicating. So please go over the different OSHA pictograms and make sure your employees know those at a glance. Next is training. And the fifth item is a written program. So these kind of go hand in hand. You want to make sure that for your school that you have a written program that defines how employees are going to be trained in the OSHA hazard communication program. And then you want to make sure that the training is documented and that you have employees sign off on their training once they attend it. In New Hampshire, one of the things that Department of Labor emphasizes for all public sector employees is that they are required to maintain a safe work environment and to provide training and tools necessary. And as I was talking with the Department of Labor contact, I think he said that statement about 4 times. So it's very, very high on their list for all employers to provide a safe work environment and to provide training and tools necessary. When I asked what the tools necessary was, he said labels, he said personal protective equipment, and engineering controls as much as possible. And we'll talk more about that as we move through the presentation today. Now, what I want to do on this slide is just kind of hold up for you my quick and dirty chemistry for the non-chemist evaluation of how do I figure out how dangerous something is by looking at a safety data sheet. Typically, safety data sheets are very long. They're usually about 16 pages. They are 16 sections, and there are consistencies that are now required under the OSHA HAZCOM standard that manufacturers have to develop associated with their safety data sheets. That's been a fairly big change just in the last 10 years, and it's been a really beneficial change because now we can actually identify at a glance what the dangers are almost immediately. And one of the things that I find this is most beneficial for schools to use is when they're deciding what products to bring on site or what vendors to work with for things like cleaning supplies, floor care, maintenance of gym floors, PE floors, new carpeting installation, all those different types of things. One of the, before you agree to bring something into your school district or into your school building, I would really encourage you to work with that vendor and get safety data sheets for any of the products that you're deciding to buy. Okay, so we're going to start off just with a real brief overview using the methanol safety data sheet as an example. A lot of times I'll work with facilities folks and I'll say, okay, we're going to talk about methanol. And they'll be like, well, we never use methanol. Well, if you use windshield washer solution in your car and your buses or any other vehicle that you have, you're probably using methanol. That's one of the main primary components in windshield washer solution. So when I'm evaluating a chemical and I'm not familiar with it, so let's say somebody comes in and they say, hey, I've got a great deal on methanol for you. I'm going to ask them first, well, I'd like to take a look at the safety data sheet. And then I'm going to zip right to section 2. Section 2 is going to list out the pictograms that show exactly the risks associated with that chemical. Section 2 is also going to have signal words like danger and warning, and danger is worse than warning. If it doesn't have the word danger and doesn't have the word warning, that's a pretty good winner in my book. That's a chemical that I'm going to deal with. If it's got danger and warning, boy, I'm going to read some more. I'm going to read the rest of the GHS classification hazards, and I'm going to figure out how this chemical is dangerous for me and also for my coworkers. And the other factor that you folks have to think about is you've got to remember too, those little bodies of the students that are in your schools, particularly elementary, are affected differently than adults are by chemicals. So we want to make absolutely certain that we're minimizing the risk and minimizing the exposure, just not only for you and for teachers and for your staff members, but also for the students that are going to be floating in and out of those buildings. So we want to make sure that we review all of those GHS classifications. And according to those hazard statements for methanol, we're going to see, wow, highly flammable and toxic if swallowed. It's also toxic if it comes into contact with the skin or if it's inhaled. That doesn't sound like good stuff. It's not great at all. Methanol is actually quite a dangerous chemical, and we don't really recognize those risks. The next section that I want you to go to, so start with section 2. Evaluate all of those different risks. Next section you're going to go to, we're going to skip forward to section 8. And in section 8 are exposure controls. Now there's a lot of big words and weird abbreviations in here. I've listed some of them out for you. But what I'm going to tell you is you don't need to know any of that stuff. What you need to know, what you need to remember on section 8 is that the lower those numbers are, the more dangerous this chemical is for you to be around. Lower numbers equal more danger. In industry, and I work with industry a lot, we've developed kind of a little rule of thumb gauge for these. If I go to section 8 and I see that all of those numbers, the TWA, the REL, the PEL, the STEL, if all of those numbers are 50 parts per million or lower, those chemicals fall into what I call the red flag zone. Those chemicals with less than 50 part per million exposure are really dangerous, because what that means is that a very, very small amount of that chemical, if I'm exposed to it, it's going to cause me some health problems. So 50 parts per million or lower is our red zone. If we look in this section and we see 50 to 500 parts per million, that's kind of my yellow flag. Proceed with caution. All right. These are not things that I want to mess with. These are risky chemicals. They're in that yellow zone, but it's not something that I'm going to be really, really, really super concerned about. I'm going to just make sure that I'm protecting myself and my people by understanding what the risks are. The final category is if we've got anything in that in those abbreviations that is 500 parts per million or greater, I'm going to call that the green zone. Okay, this is not something I'm going to pour over my Cheerios and have for breakfast. Okay, this is still a chemical. I'm going to have a lot of respect for it. I'm still going to pay attention to those section 2 pictograms and hazard warnings. And I'm going to evaluate what are my different exposure routes. How is this chemical going to try to make me sick? But a green zone chemical is one that I would strongly consider bringing in and using. We still need to have respect for it. But if we're choosing between something that's got 50 parts per million or less and is in that red zone, or a chemical that all of the components are 500 parts per million or greater in the green zone, I'm going to choose that green zone chemical. As you are making decisions about what chemicals to bring into school, this is, I think, one of the most critical sections for you to evaluate. This is going to tell you specifically, also in this section, there will be information and data about whether or not this is carcinogenic. There'll be some information about whether or not this is a reproductive toxin. You want to pay very close attention to that before you decide that you're going to go ahead and choose to bring this chemical into your school or into your district. And just a word of warning that over the years, I have run into a few situations where a sales rep doesn't have access to a safety data sheet. Or when they hand you the safety data sheet, it's filled with language like, well, this is trade secret. I'm going to tell you that if I can't identify what the risks are, if I can't identify how risky the chemical is and what the threats are to myself, I'm not going to use that chemical. It's just not worth the risk to me. I've been doing this a really long time. So you absolutely have the authority and the right to know exactly what you're working with. And I would have that discussion with the vendor. You're going to have to provide me with better information or we're just not going to use your product. The last section, that we're going to talk about is section 9. And this is not so much for you to identify what the risky components are or how this chemical is going to affect you, but it's more targeted at what are you going to have to do with this chemical to manage the waste from it safely and properly according to regulations. I've listed for you here a couple of the things that section 9, which covers the physical and chemical properties of the chemicals that we're dealing with. What are some of the things that I look for? The first one that I look for is flash point. Flash point is something that we use to measure how flammable something is or how ignitable something is. And according to EPA, if we've got a chemical that has a flash point of less than 140 Fahrenheit, that's an ignitable hazardous waste once we're done with it. So if you have the opportunity, let's say we're looking at parts washer solution. We've got a bus barn, we've got a facility, an industrial tech facility that has an automotive department, and they want a parts washer. When we look at parts washer solution, what I would encourage you to do is you're going to have a whole bunch of choices on what kind to use. And I would encourage you to look for those that have a flash point of greater than 140. So if we're up at a flash point of 155 Fahrenheit, then according to EPA, that is no longer a hazardous chemical. Does not mean that we can dump it down the drain. Does not mean we can dump it out in a ditch. Doesn't mean we can take it out and stick it in a pile on the football field and light it on fire. Those are all questions that have come up over the years. Can't do that stuff. But it does mean that the regulations are less stringent on how we handle that. I would encourage you to really look at the different chemical properties. Flash point of less than 140, that's going to be an EPA hazardous waste if you decide to get rid of it. The pH, if it has a pH of less than 2 or greater than 12.5, then it's considered an EPA corrosive, also a hazardous chemical, will also be highly regulated if you decide to get rid of it. For a lot of safety data sheets, this information isn't complete. The information might not be available. There might be an NA listed in it. And if you come up with a safety data sheet where almost all of those measurements are NA or not applicable, or they're not filled in, that's another red flag for me. And it's a good indication that the manufacturer is really not focused on helping you out with safety and environmental stuff. I think you really need to have this filled in and completed so there's good transparency on what the risks are with what you're dealing with. That's another piece of information that I would use when I'm making a product decision. I would encourage you to make sure that you have as much information as you possibly can get about products before you bring them into the school. Okay. I kind of covered this already, but if a chemical meets any of the following criteria, it's also pretty highly regulated. It's likely that it's going to be highly regulated if you use it and if you try to dispose of it. Flash point less than 140, pH of less than 2 or greater than 12.5. And then again, any of those exposure measurements, PEL, TWA, STEL of less than 50 parts per million. One of the things that we need to think about also are the routes of exposure. And you'll find this information further in different sections, in various sections on the safety data sheet. After you start with section 2, then go to section 8, then go to section 9. If you've still determined that, boy, this is a good product, I like the results here, I'm going to go ahead and think about bringing it in to use it. The next step that I would ask you to look at is, what are the routes of exposure for this chemical? There are 4 routes of exposure: inhalation, ingestion, injection, and absorption. The most dangerous and the one that affects people the most typically is inhalation. And the reason is because we just can't see the vapors or how far they travel off of a lot of these products. When you're working on something, if it's got a low flash point and it's a hot day, know that even though you can't see those vapors, a lot of times those are volatilizing off that chemical, and your workers or you end up breathing them in while you're using them. We want to know if those are going to affect you and how they're going to affect you. So take a look at section 8. It's going to provide you with different exposure levels for ingestion, injection, inhalation, and absorption. And then decide after you read that, is this worth the risk or not? Is the risk greater than the reward of using this particular product? Also, please know that over the years, one of the challenges that I've really run into a lot is that our marketing information that we receive from a lot of the folks that are out selling these products will give you the appearance that the chemicals they're selling are not dangerous. There are no health ramifications. They just make everything shiny and sparkly and smell good. What I have found over the years is that you have to dig a little deeper than just following the marketing information. Please make sure that you ask for a safety data sheet. And please consider that if the safety data sheet isn't filled out very completely, if they're not providing you with good quality information to help you make that decision, then you need to ask yourself, what are they hiding? And why is this information not available to me? Again, then move back into that. Is the risk of using this greater than the reward or not? All right. Next section that we're going to move into is we're going to move from identifying whether or not chemicals are dangerous and how dangerous they are for us to work with, to what are some of the disposal strategies. So as you're going through the end of the year, there are going to be some items that you identify that, wow, we haven't touched this in 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 or 40 years. Before you just throw those in the trash, we need to make absolutely certain that we're evaluating them for risk and that we're also evaluating them for disposal compliance. And these regulations are tough. Facilities always seems to be the collecting point, not just for chemical waste, but also I've heard stories of, you know, I walked into my office and here sitting on my desk is a bag of pills from the nurse that she wants to get rid of. Oh, geez, not great. very, very challenging. The first thing that I would ask you to do is make sure that you set some policies and make sure that you clearly communicate those to everybody in the school. Please do not bring things that you don't know what they are, or that chemicals that you no longer want. Please don't bring them to my office and set them on my desk. I've had facilities folks over the years that have just been so frustrated because all of a sudden stuff just shows up. So please make absolutely certain that you clearly communicate to them. If they have something to dispose of, they need to fill out a work order, send you an email, call you, put a Post-it note on your desk, some other method than just bringing something down and setting it in your office or on a cart in the custodial area. A lot of times facilities personnel are asked for disposal help from pretty much every department in the school. One of the other things that we also get, and that I know that I've had a lot of feedback from facilities personnel, is that they get a lot of questions and concerns about, can you help me improve the ventilation, particularly in art classrooms and science classrooms. We don't have a whole lot of, I don't have a whole lot of information. I have some information on options for you to improve ventilation, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes. When you are assisting others with disposal strategies, if you are the person that's going to be meeting with a hazardous waste company, or you're the person that makes the phone call to the landfill, make sure that before you do either of those things that you understand the regulations that you're working under. If you have questions about that, please reach out. This is the time that you need to implement that phone a friend thing. Reach out and find out who a good resource is for you so that you understand the requirements and the steps that you're going to have to take to dispose of things properly and in compliance with the regulations. And again, the differences even between Vermont and New Hampshire and where I'm located in Iowa, the differences in disposal requirements are substantial. So please make absolutely certain that you reach out to someone to ask for help. For indoor air quality concerns, you may also need outside support. Air systems, balancing air systems, managing air systems can be very, very challenging. It's another area that if you need help, please reach out and we'll find you some resources to talk to. All right. Regarding disposal, before you dump any chemicals down the drain or in the trash, evaporate them up a hood, toss them. There are some strategies that you can implement to make sure that you're in compliance. If, again, keeping in mind that if a chemical is determined too risky for you to use, it's probably going to be regulated. Disposal is regulated by a lot of different entities. You want to reach out to your state regulator or phone a friend, because if you do something incorrect, if you dispose of things incorrectly, the penalty dollars for this are exorbitant. They can be very, very high. About 10 or 15 years ago, EPA did a focus on universities and colleges and how they were disposing of chemicals. And a number of them faced extremely high penalties. We're talking $50, $80, $100,000 fines and penalties and above. We absolutely have to avoid that. So please reach out if you need some help. Before resorting to disposal, if there are things that as you're going through your facilities and the chemicals that you use, if you're going through and you're identifying things that you want to get rid of, before it goes in the disposal pile, especially if it's been partially used, I'd like you to ask yourself, can you just use up this chemical for its intended purpose? If you've got a bunch of stain or varnish, stain or varnish is designed and created as a product to seal fences and boards and decks. So is there a way that you can use the remainder of that that's in the container? Use it. If you use it for its intended purpose, it never enters into the waste stream. So really think about how you can use, especially partially used containers. How can you use them for their intended purpose? Once they're empty, the vast majority of those empty containers can go in the trash. If a chemical is from a vendor and you have a lot of it left over, you may want to ask that vendor, can you guys take this back? Can you reformulate it? Can you take it back? Can you give us a credit? We're not going to be using it. There's also a state service that's provided by a number of states called a waste exchange. If you're changing vendors for your cleaning chemicals and you have unused containers left over, you may reach out and see if your state has a waste exchange. And if there's another school that's using those products, you might be able to provide those products to the other school. You won't have to pay for waste disposal, and they won't have to purchase new product. So it's a win-win for everybody. You might want to reach out and see if your school has a waste exchange. Finally, this is one of the things that is really surprising to me. But if you have a container that you're thinking about getting rid of, and there's only a small amount left in the container, keep in mind that your hazardous waste disposal companies will frequently charge you by the piece for disposal. So if you can use the rest of that material up until the container is empty, that's going to be a great cost-saving strategy for you. Frequently, one of the things I see a lot of is paint, lots and lots and lots of paint. And it takes up a lot of shelf space and nobody knows how old it is. And it's just not a great thing to keep around. One of the things, instead of disposing of it, use it for its intended purpose. What are the other things you can paint? How can you use this up? Same thing with cleaning supplies. One of the things that a lot of states allow is for latex paint, you can dry it and throw it in the trash. However, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, you have to check and see if that's legal in your state, because not every state handles latex paint that way. Okay. Now, this is a lot of words on it, and so I just want to kind of go through. This is an example of disposal of a chemical that is sometimes used in schools, a lot of times used in households. Not a lot, but a lot of people buy it and then they get scared by it and stop using it. But I want to go through what the cost analysis is to get rid of a container of muriatic acid. And the whole reason for us to go through this example is for me to help you understand that just because you purchase a chemical for a fairly low cost, if you decide then that you don't want to use that chemical and you go to dispose of it, the cost is unbelievably extensively increased. So please keep this in consideration as you're choosing to bring new chemicals on your facility site or into your school. So let's go through this cost analysis. So I go out and I just recently worked with one of our household hazardous waste employees. So I know my numbers are correct. But if I go out and I purchase 1 quart of muriatic acid because I want to clean some cement or clean some brick, that's predominantly what it's used for, is to clean brick or clean cement. Muriatic acid is 37% hydrochloric acid. When I open that lid, if I get a nose full of it, it's going to make me cough. It's going to burn my nose. It's going to burn my eyes. It's wicked bad stuff. If I don't understand the risks with it, and I don't have the appropriate personal protective equipment and procedures in place to handle it, bad things are going to happen. So in my little scenario here, the employee opens the container, he pours out about a half a cup of it onto the cement, and immediately his eyes start burning. He begins coughing because some of those fumes have snuck up and messed up his nose. This is bad stuff. The employee is not prepared to use it, doesn't have the right PPE, doesn't have the right training in how to safely use this. So the employee closes the container, tells the supervisor, this stuff needs to go away. It is bad. And I'm going to ignore the half a cup right now for our scenario. I'm going to ignore the half a cup that's foaming right now on the cement in the parking lot. Once the employee is done, closes the container up, talks to a supervisor, let's go through the costs to getting rid of this. So the first thing the hazardous waste company is going to do is they're going to stick it in a 5-gallon DOT shippable corrosives bucket. They charge you about 15 bucks for that. They're going to then cover the bottom of that and around that container with vermiculite or some other absorbent. And the typical cost that they're going to charge you is $48. They'll charge you for a whole bag of vermiculite, even if it only takes about 4 inches. They're going to charge you what's called mobilization, transportation, and demurrage fee. I can never say that word right. And those fees are about 450 bucks. And that's just to get them and their truck with all their supplies to your site. Once they come to your site, they're going to package that in a 5-gallon bucket, and they're going to charge you $225 for disposal of that chemical in just one 5-gallon bucket, even if there's nothing else in that 5-gallon bucket. They're going to charge you chemist time of 90 bucks, PPE of about 100 bucks. They're going to charge you a $50 manifest fee. That's the documentation that you have to have in place to dispose of this. And they're going to charge you a fuel surcharge, usually around 5% of the total cost. So the total disposal for this $8.95 quart of muriatic acid runs at a little over $1,000 bucks. And this is very typical. I see this all the time. This is why it's really critical for you, before you bring those chemicals onto your site, for you to evaluate the risk. Look at section 2 of the safety data sheet, look at section 8, and look at section 9. This is one of those instances that this is such a dangerous chemical that to use it for its intended purpose, we're going to have a lot of safety precautions in place. And in my assessment, it's not worth it, because a work comp claim is still going to be higher than that $1,000 disposal fee. Best option, we should have had in our purchasing practices that we don't buy things like muriatic acid. Not worth it. This is one of those chemicals where the risk far exceeds the utility. All right. Next section that we're going to talk about is how we keep your personnel safe around all of the hazardous chemicals that are present in the science rooms, the art rooms, industrial tech, the things that just show up in your area of the world, or also the stuff that's sitting on shelves and in closets. First thing we want to do is we want to evaluate the inventory of the chemicals that your workers are going to be exposed to. And inventory is one of the requirements under the HAZCOM plan, under the HAZCOM program, which is that 1910-1200 program. It involves safety data sheets. It also requires that there's an inventory. And the inventory has to include the name of the chemical and the quantity of the chemical. You want to evaluate that and figure out what the disposal procedure is before those chemicals show up for disposal in your facility. I would encourage you to make sure that anybody in the sciences, arts, or industrial tech, that they're collecting and maintaining their safety data sheets. And as a facilities manager, because you're probably going to be involved if there is an accident or an incident, you need to have a copy of the inventory of what they have in their classroom or in their stockroom. You also need to have access to those safety data sheets, because chances are you're going to be the one that's interfacing with any emergency responders. Ask for the inventory, evaluate the risks. Before you have any teachers bring you anything for disposal, have the disposal plan in place. A better option is to leave those in individual classrooms and have your hazardous waste company go to each classroom and pack the chemicals there. You also may want to consider working with other schools for what's called a milk run. It's where you reach out to a hazardous waste company to say, hey, we've got, 250 pounds of chemicals that need to go away. The school down the road has 300 pounds. The school beyond them has 120 pounds. Can you put us on a milk run so that we can minimize our transportation costs or our demurrage costs? And a lot of times the hazardous waste companies will help you with that. Additionally, you want to keep those chemicals in the areas where they're being generated or where people are deciding they want to get rid of them. We want to move them around as little as possible. Less movement of those chemicals means less risk of spills, accidents, exposures, general problems. The school disposal needs to be coordinated at the school level. And that's one of the things that it's really a challenge for some of our teachers to understand. We have art teachers that decide at the end of the year, okay, we're going to get rid of all this stuff. We have science teachers that create their inventory of chemicals for disposal. One of the things that the facilities person has to keep in mind is that regulators look at the school as a whole. And the more waste that you're getting rid of at one time, the more potential there is for regulatory violations and more regulations. So it's really important for you to coordinate disposal with a chemical hygiene team or a safety committee. Additionally, waste disposal companies charge by the trip. So if you decide in April, well, we've got a bunch of stuff to get rid of, and you do a clean out in April, and then in June, you learn you have a bunch more stuff, they're going to charge you another trip fee. It's another $400 to $600 or more, depending on where you're located. Be mindful of the quantities that you're disposing. Again, encourage use of the chemical for its intended purpose. Use it up if possible. If it's just too dangerous, then it goes on that disposal list, and you'll need to work with your hazardous waste disposal company to identify the costs, and then also ask them if there are any other cost-saving strategies that they can assist you with. Once you've conducted that initial cleanup, make sure that you're working with anybody that's using chemicals on site so that you implement proper purchasing strategies, smart purchasing policies, so we're not bringing in more dangerous chemicals. Best practice is evaluate that safety data sheet first. If there's too many holes in it, or if it looks too risky, that's something you shouldn't have on site. Anytime we're dealing with employees and hazardous chemicals, we want to follow OSHA's guidelines on what's called the hierarchy of control. And I know that's just a crazy phrase. It can be very confusing for those folks that don't work in safety all the time. But basically what this is kind of a roadmap. And what OSHA encourages is that you work from the top down. First of all, you physically remove any hazards or any chemicals where risk exceeds utility. Second step is you substitute in less toxic, less dangerous, less hazardous chemicals. Now, if there are things that we have to use and they do present risk, and we're going to run into chemicals like that, then the next step is to engineer out exposure. And we see this a lot in science, and we see this a lot in the art classrooms, and sometimes we see it in industrial tech, depending on their processes. By engineering out exposure, what we mean is install a working fume hood, check the fume hood, make sure that the filters have been changed and that it's actually pulling and drawing air at the appropriate rate. Add in additional ventilation to a classroom, like makeup air, to minimize further exposure. Those are engineering methods. The next step is administratively controlled exposures. What that means is that we develop SOPs, standard operating procedures, and this works particularly well for staff. So if I've got staff and they're going to do floor cleaning and they're going to use a cleaner stripper that is flammable and it's got some toxicity to it. Okay. Let's say it's got a PEL of 250 parts per million. 250 is in that yellow zone. So we're going to make sure that we add ventilation. We might put a fan at the end of the hallway so that, and we might put it to our employees' backs so that it's blowing the fumes and vapors away from them as they're working. We might say, you know what? We don't want you to be exposed, so we're going to open up all the doorways to the facility. We're going to air out the entire school while you're working with this stuff. And you're only going to do this process 2 or 3 hours a day. Those are administrative controls. Then the next step is your last resort, and that's what we call personal protective equipment. And that's where we're talking about chemical resistant gloves, safety glasses, or chemical resistant goggles. All of those things need to be written down in an SOP for any time we're working with any types of chemicals. For purchasing practices that you really need to implement with your safety committee for school-wide implementation is to use only what you will use up to, or to purchase, excuse me, only what you're going to use up in 2 or 3 years. We do not want large stockpiles laying around. It just presents way more risk. As you're deciding what to purchase from vendors, make sure that you're purchasing only compatible products. The last thing you want to do is have somebody mix something inadvertently and generate a giant gas cloud of bad stuff. And then finally, make sure your staff is trained that they do not mix chemicals unless they are clearly supposed to be mixed. And we've done training and written an SOP on that. To keep your facilities personnel safe around hazardous chemicals, I would also encourage you to work with your safety committee to adopt what's called a no donations policy. I don't see this as much as I did 10, 15 years ago, but what we were seeing at that point in time is we were seeing a lot of small businesses that would take what they didn't want anymore and donate them to the school. What that ends up being is they're dumping their waste that they don't want to pay for onto your school. Unless you have an absolute specific use for something and it's going to be gone in 2 or 3 years, no donations. Require before a new chemical is purchased or a new process comes into place, conduct a safety evaluation. In industry, we call this a process hazard analysis. And I have guidance on this if you're interested in it. But conduct that safety evaluation before you bring those things on site. And then I'm going to encourage you as facilities also to conduct what's called a safety walk. Build up a checklist. We're not going to call it an audit, but build up a checklist and then divide the school into different areas. This doesn't mean it's something else that you have to do. Maybe you develop a safety checklist for your science areas, and then you ask the science teachers to do that. For training for your facilities employees, now this is not all inclusive, okay? This is just based on HAZCOM. Make sure that you're training your employees so that they recognize those pictograms at a glance and they know how to read the safety data sheets. Again, focus on sections 2, 8, and 9. Encourage transparency. If your facilities folks see something and they think it's wrong or dangerous, make sure that they feel empowered to bring that either to a safety committee or to the facilities personnel. And then make sure that we're identifying and requiring personal protective equipment based on the risks identified by the safety data sheet. Now, next webinar is on student safety in the lab. Please meet with your science people. I'd love to have as many science personnel in attendance as possible. We are continuing to see some pretty rotten accidents that are hurting teachers and students across the United States. We've particularly seen a bump up since everybody's returned to in-class training after COVID. So we're going to discuss the experiments that we're seeing that are causing the majority of accidents, recommendations from the American Chemical Society and various other entities to minimize lab accidents, and steps that your teachers can take to prevent and prepare to respond to emergencies. And please encourage them to bring any questions that they might have. Things that you can do today, steps you can take today, make sure your training sessions for your staff are in order for hazard communication. And I know everybody typically does the quick review at the beginning of the year, checkbox for, yep, I've been HAZCOM trained. Dig into it a little. Really pull a couple of safety data sheets for chemicals that you use and go through them. Again, sections 2, 8, and 9. They're going to give you the most information. Prepare instructions and procedures for disposal of hazardous chemicals that you know are being used. Prepare and implement a safety walk around. And then identify resources to help you navigate hazardous waste disposal. If you need help with that, please reach out to me. Finally, encourage your teachers to attend the science safety. Now, here's my contact information. There's my phone number, my email, my website. And I've been asked to also address PFAS. PFAS are those what we're calling forever chemicals, or they've been named forever chemicals. One of the things that PFAS shows up in a lot is in floor strippers. Please make sure before you dispose of your floor stripper down the drain that you identify whether or not it has PFAS in it. And you should be able to, now this is a really hot topic. So you should be able to ask your vendor or your supply company whether or not it's got PFAS in it. And I believe they're required by now, depending on the state you're in, they're required to disclose whether or not there's PFAS in it. One of the things that we see though is these particular chemicals are in very, very small percentages, but they have 1,000-year impacts on our waterways. They are not filtered out by our wastewater treatment plants. So a lot of times they end up in our drinking water. So please make sure that you're aware whether or not you have PFAS. And this is going to be a hot topic over the next few years. If you have specific questions about that, please let me know. Please reach out to me. All right, I've gone about 2 minutes over today. I apologize for taking a little extra of your time. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer. And I'll do what I can to get you taken care of. If you don't have time to do that, send me an email or give me a call. Happy to help as much as I can. All right, do we have any questions?
Okay. I don't see any, Becky. Thank you so much.
Yes, you bet. All right. Thank you so much again for your time. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, you guys take care and have a good rest of the year. I'm thinking happy thoughts for all of you.